The plains lay silent beneath a blood-red sky as the last light of day stretched long over the grass. Silas Mercer rode slow, his horse weary from miles that had no end, his eyes drawn always to the horizon, where memory and regret lived side by side. He had built this ranch with his wife plank by plank, dream by dream, but death had taken her in a fever and left him with nothing but empty rooms and a worn rifle. The cattle were gone now, stolen in raids, and Silas lived more like a ghost among the charred remains of fences that no longer held anything in. Yet he stayed, as if by staying, he might anchor the pieces of himself that still remembered hope. He was almost to the barn when the sound came. It was not the rustle of wind through dry grass, nor the distant howl of coyote. This sound was heavier, the ragged pounding of boots against dirt chased by the sharper rhythm of hooves. Silas tightened the reins, his horse shifting uneasy. From the shadows of the ridge, a figure stumbled forward and collapsed at his feet. A woman tall and strong, her skin bronze from the sun, shackles still heavy around her wrists. Her chest heaved, each breath torn from a body that had been pushed too far. Her dark eyes found his for an instant, blazing with both desperation and defiance before they fluttered closed. Silas slid from the saddle, kneeling in the dust beside her. The heat of her skin was sharp fevered blood soaking into the ground beneath one shoulder. Her muscles were hard as stone, yet she trembled. Before he could speak, a shout cut through the night air. "There she is, don't let her get away." Torches flickered on the ridge soldiers, pressing their mounts hard, their voices rolling closer. Silas's hand went to his holster, his thumb grazing the grip of the Colt, but his mind raced faster than his trigger finger. He could ride away, leave her where she lay. It would be the safer choice. Yet when he looked down at her face streaked with dirt and blood, he saw not a stranger, but someone who had been stripped of everything except the will to survive. And he heard the question in her silence, the same question his wife's eyes had once asked him in her final hours. "What will you do?" Silas did not give himself time to answer. He hauled her up her weight, forcing his teeth to grit, and dragged her toward the barn. The hay wagon sat waiting, a hollow big enough to swallow a body whole. He pulled the lid open, shoved her down into the straw, and covered her quick heart pounding in his throat. The torches reached the yard in a blaze of light. 3 cavalrymen dismounted, their rifles gleaming. "Did you see her?" one barked. "An Indian woman. She came this way." Silas stood tall dust on his boots, his hand resting loose on the Colt, though his pulse thundered. "No," he said evenly. "Just me and this horse." Silence stretched long and sharp as a drawn bowstring. The soldiers' eyes narrowed, torches hissing in the night wind. Then with muttered curses they turned their mounts and rode on, dust and firelight trailing behind. Silas waited until the last hoofbeat faded. Then he lifted the wagon lid. 2 black eyes stared up at him, unblinking, filled with the raw question of trust. "Come on," he muttered, pulling her free of the straw. He half carried her into the cabin, the oil lamp throwing shadows across the cracked wooden wall. He laid her down on the rug by the fire. The scent of blood and dust thickened the air, mingling with smoke. Silas opened the chest, pulled out his hammer, and crouched beside her shackled wrist. "Keep still," he said softly. One sharp strike rang out, metal shattering against wood. The shackle dropped, leaving a raw red welt across her arm. She did not flinch. Her eyes locked on his, fierce even through pain. Silas tore a strip of cloth, wrapping it around her wound with a gentleness that surprised him. "You're burning up," he murmured. He lifted a canteen to her lips. She hesitated, then drank in small gulps, water spilling down her chin. Neither of them spoke. Outside, the night wind howled across the empty plains. Inside, the cabin breathed with firelight and the fragile weight of choices that could not be undone. The fire hissed as resin bled from the logs, sending small sparks into the shadows. The woman sat propped against the wall, the frayed blanket drawn around her shoulders like armor. Her chest rose and fell in shallow pulls, but her eyes never left the door. Silas studied her in the lamplight, noticing the lattice of scars across her arms. Each one a story of battles she had been forced to fight. He had questions: who she was, how she had come this far, why the soldiers chased her, but he kept them behind his teeth. Questions could wait. Survival could not. He checked the windows, tightened the latch on the door, then set the Winchester across his knees. When silence stretched too long, she spoke. Her voice was rough, broken English, thick with an accent but steady. Awanada, she said, pressing a hand to her chest. Silas gave a single nod. Silas. The fire crackled between them, their names floating in the air like fragile offerings. He poured water into a tin cup and set it near her. She reached for it, wrists trembling, shackled skin still raw. She drank in small sips, gaze fixed on him, as if waiting for betrayal that never came. At last she said, "They killed my people. Women, children. All gone. They took me." Her words were blunt, but the pain in them was a blade without a sheath. Silas tightened his grip on the rifle jaw locked. Memory rose unbidden the night his wife coughed her last breath and he had sat helpless watching death claim what he loved. He asked quietly, "How did you get free?" Awanada looked down at her wrists, the fresh welts left by the broken shackles. "I waited. When they were drunk, I broke the lock. I ran." Her voice caught for the first time, not from fear, but from exhaustion. A gust slammed against the cabin, rattling the shutters, making the lamp flicker. Silas rose, stepped onto the porch. The night stretched wide hills dark against the sky. Far off, a glow burned campfires too many to ignore. The cavalry was not gone. They were waiting, coiling like a snake in the grass. He came back inside, dust clinging to his coat. Awanada sat tall now, her shadow stretching across the wall. The panic he had first seen in her eyes had cooled into something harder. "They will come," she said simply. Silas nodded, voice low. "And if they do, they'll have to come through me." She studied him for a long moment, then pulled the blanket tighter. For the first time, her eyes softened. Not surrender, but the faintest trace of trust. The fire whispered and popped, and in that fragile stillness, Silas knew the dawn would not bring peace. It would bring a test neither of them could run from. Dawn crept across the plains in a haze of gray light, spilling weakly through the cabin's cracks. Silas had not closed his eyes once, the Winchester balanced across his knees, ears tuned to every whisper outside. Awanada stirred with the first warmth, pushing the blanket from her shoulders. The fever sweat that had clung to her skin was drying, leaving her face sharper, more resolute. Silas pushed himself to his feet and opened the door to the cold morning. Frost crusted the ground, but the tracks were fresh, deep dents of hooves circling the ranch. He crouched low, running his hand along one imprint. Too many to count at least a dozen riders. He spat into the dust and straightened jaw set. Awanada had stepped to the doorway, the blanket draped around her like a warrior's cloak. "They watch from the hills," she said. Her eyes scanned the ridges as if she could see beyond the distance, beyond the fog. "They won't leave," Silas muttered. "They're waiting for me to hand you over." She tilted her chin, voice firm. "I will not go back, not alive." He met her gaze, the hardness in it reflecting his own buried resolve. "Then we don't run." The morning passed in a restless rhythm. Silas patched the window shutters with iron nails and spare boards. Awanada, though weakened, gathered hay bales and stacked them into crude barricades around the cattle pen. Her muscles rippled as she worked, sweat cutting through dust on her bronze skin. Each strike of her hands, each lift of timber spoke of strength that no chain had managed to break. Silas found himself watching her the way determination carved lines into her face. He had seen men broken easier than her, and yet here she was, battered, hunted, and still unbent. By midday, they sat in the cabin again, chewing dry bread, the silence heavy but not empty. The fire snapped, filling in words neither of them spoke. Then a sharp sound split the quiet. Hooves, measured, deliberate. A lone rider descended the ridge, stopping just outside the gate. Silas stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand, eyes narrowed. The soldier raised a rolled paper high and shouted, "Rancher, listen well. Hand over the prisoner before sunrise or we'll bring the company down and burn this place to ash." He flung the paper into the dirt and wheeled his horse back toward the hills. Dust rose, curling like smoke in the morning air. Awanada came to stand beside Silas, tall. Her shadow stretched wide across the yard. Her dark eyes followed the retreating soldier, then settled on the ultimatum at their feet. Silas bent, picked it up, and crumpled it in his hand. The paper crackled like dry tinder. "They think they can scare us out," he said quietly. Awanada's shoulders squared. "Let them come. I am finished with running." Silas studied her for a long moment, then tossed the paper into the fire. The flames leapt high, devouring every word of threat. The cabin walls flickered with gold shadows, bending and shifting. Awanada's eyes caught the light burning with something fiercer than fear. Silas nodded once. "Then we fight." The afternoon passed with no rest. Silas and Awanata moved like two parts of the same machine, each task done without wasted words. He reinforced the door with iron nails and crossbeams torn from the old shed. She dragged heavy timbers across the yard, stacking them in rough cover near the corral. When he set sandbags under the windows, she was already filling barrels with water to fight fire. Every so often, Silas caught himself glancing at her, not with doubt, but with a quiet astonishment. She worked like someone who had built barricades before, who had fought to keep breath in her chest when the world demanded it be taken away. Sweat streaked down her back, catching the late sun. In that light, she no longer looked like the hunted. She looked like a warrior rising again from the ashes of her people. By dusk, the sky burned red clouds like torn cloth strung across the horizon. Silas wiped his brow hands raw from hammer and rope. They ate together by the stove, only scraps of dried meat chewing in silence, while the air between them thickened with anticipation. Awanata stiffened suddenly, her head tilting. "Hooves," she whispered. Silas rose, rifle in hand. He stepped onto the porch. In the distance along the ridge, dozens of torches flared to life, spreading in a wide circle. A wall of fire crowned the hills, soldiers' shadows moving like predators around the rim of the valley. Awanata joined him, the blanket sliding from her shoulders, leaving only muscle and scars in the firelight. Her dark eyes burned not with fear, but with a steady flame. "They are here." Silas drew back the hammer on the Winchester. The cold click echoed in the night, swallowed quickly by the wind. "Let them come," he said. "This is my home." Awanata's hand tightened around the spear she had fashioned from an iron rake in a length of oak. Together they stood on the porch, their shadows stretching long across the dirt, facing the encroaching ring of fire. For a heartbeat, the valley held still, as if the land itself was waiting. Then the torches began to move down the hill, slow at first, then faster, a serpent of flame slithering toward the cabin. Awanata's voice was low, steady. "We fight." Silas gave a single nod, his gray eyes hard as steel. "To the end." And in that moment, as the torches closed in, and the first echo of hooves thundered through the earth, the cabin ceased to be a lonely outpost. It became a fortress, a stand against the darkness. The first shots split the night like lightning-sharp cracks that echoed across the valley. A bullet slammed into the porch post inches from Silas's head, splinters stinging his cheek. He gritted his teeth, raised the Winchester, and fired. The recoil jolted his shoulder as one rider toppled from the saddle torch, tumbling into the snow. Awanata let out a cry that was part fury, part memory, and surged to the back door. The makeshift spear glinted in the torchlight as a soldier tried to climb through the window. She struck with a clean, brutal force, knocking him back into the dirt. Another man lunged, and she met him with her bare hands, muscles coiled like iron. "Front porch," Silas shouted. Flames flared as a bottle of kerosene shattered against the cabin wall. Fire roared up, smoke curling black into the rafters. Silas grabbed a water barrel, heaving it across the porch to smother the blaze. Heat scorched his face, but the flames died with a hiss. Gunfire rattled the night lead, slamming into the walls, breaking glass, chewing into wood. Silas dropped behind a window frame, breath steady, and fired again. Another rider fell, his shadow thrashing, before silence claimed him. Awanata charged back inside, blood streaking her arm, but her eyes wild with fire. She blocked the side entrance, striking two soldiers in quick succession. One crumpled under her spear, the other reeled back long enough for Silas to finish him with a shot. The cabin shook with violence, hooves pounding rifles, cracking flames trying to catch. The air was thick with smoke and the sour tang of powder. Silas reloaded by touch, his fingers blackened, his ears ringing with every shot. Outside, the ring of torches pressed closer, soldiers regrouping. Then a tall figure on horseback rode forward, firelight gleaming on his insignia. His voice boomed across the yard. "Rancher, this is your last chance. Hand over the woman, or you die here tonight." Silas stepped into the doorway, shoulders squared, rifle steady. His voice cut through the chaos, low and rough as split timber. "If you want her, you'll walk through me first." Awanata came to stand beside him, her spear dripping red, her chest rising and falling with iron resolve. Her dark eyes shone fierce and unbroken. The officer's answer was a wave of rifles, cocking the sound like thunder building in the hills. The torches surged forward, the noose tightening once more. Awanata's voice was quiet but sure. "Then we fight to the end." Silas met her gaze for a single heartbeat, then cocked the Winchester. Side by side. And when the next volley of fire tore the sky open, the two of them moved as one shadows locked against the blaze, holding their ground where no one thought they could stand. The valley roared with chaos. Torches streaked like falling stars as soldiers poured down the hillside. Hooves thundered, the ground trembling with each charge. Bullets screamed past the cabin walls, splitting timber and shattering glass. Silas crouched low by the window, his finger tight on the Winchester's trigger. He waited until the riders closed in their faces, sharp in the firelight, then fired. The rifle bucked and a man fell from his horse, rolling lifeless through the dirt. He worked the lever fast, fired again, smoke burning his throat. Awanata burst from the back door with a cry that split the night. Her spear flashed, striking down a soldier as he leapt the fence. Another came at her with a bayonet, but she ducked low, seized his wrist, and wrenched the weapon free before driving him to the ground. She stood tall, blood streaking her bronze arms, a living wall of defiance. Awanata back inside, Silas shouted, but she shook her head, holding her ground. A torch arced through the air, smashing against the roof. Flames flared bright, climbing fast. Smoke rolled down in choking waves. Silas grabbed a second barrel of water, heaving it upward, soaking the shingles until the blaze hissed into steam. His lungs burned, but he kept moving, kept firing. The soldiers pressed harder, circling, shouting orders. The officer on the hill raised his sword, the steel catching the firelight. A volley of gunshots rang out, bullets hammering the cabin walls. One slammed into the doorframe, splinters tearing into Silas's arm. He hissed but held steady, pulling the trigger again and again. Awanata fought like a storm beside him. When a rider crashed through the corral fence, she leapt onto the beams, drove her spear through his chest, and pulled free with a snarl. Her dark eyes burned not with panic, but with a fierce fire that Silas could feel even through the smoke. The porch shook as soldiers tried to storm it. Silas met them head-on, firing point blank, the rifle roaring in his hands. The recoil numbed his shoulder, but he did not falter. Awanata slammed into the doorway, blocking another with the broken haft of her spear. Together they forced the intruders back step by bloody step. Then came a sudden lull. The gunfire eased. The riders pulled away, regrouping beyond the torches. The officer's voice cut through the smoke. "You cannot win, rancher. The dawn will bury you." Silas spat into the dirt, blood streaking his cheek. "We'll see about that." Awanata stood beside him, chest heaving, sweat and ash painting her skin. She looked at Silas, her voice steady. "If this is the end, I stand with you." He met her gaze, gray eyes lit by firelight. "Then we'll end it together." And as the soldiers prepared their next charge, the two of them braced once more side by side in the storm, ready to hold the line until the world itself gave way. The night dragged into eternity, each second marked by firelight, smoke, and the pounding of hooves. The cavalry circled again, their torches forming a blazing crescent on the ridge. Shouts carried over the wind, promises of death, threats of fire. Silas leaned against the doorframe, his body shaking from blood loss, the Winchester hot in his hands. Every time he blinked, he saw his wife's face in the fever light, and every time he opened his eyes, he saw Awanata standing tall beside him, spear raised unbroken. The final charge came like thunder, splitting the earth. Dozens of riders stormed down the slope, flames painting their faces in hellish glow. Bullets ripped into the cabin. Glass shattered, splinters rained from the beams. Silas fired until the rifle clicked empty, then drew his Colt, the blast deafening in the narrow room. Awanata moved like a force of nature, striking, shoving, dragging wounded men into the mud, her voice a raw battle cry that echoed through the smoke. Fire licked the roof again, and Silas grabbed a sodden blanket, smothering the flames until his hands blistered. Awanata covered him, driving back two soldiers who tried to break through the window. Blood streaked her arm, but her grip never faltered. The fighting blurred into chaos, smoke screams, the iron taste of powder thick on their tongues. Then as the eastern sky began to pale, the bugle call rose sharp and shrill. Retreat. The cavalry began to pull back, dragging their wounded, their torches flickering as they vanished into the mist. The valley fell quiet except for the crackle of dying flames and the labored breaths of two souls who had refused to fall. Silas sank onto the porch steps, chest heaving, the Colt slipping from his hand. Awanata stood in the yard, her shoulders dusted with ash, her spear planted firm in the earth like a banner of survival. The sunrise washed over her, turning her into a figure of bronze and fire, a warrior no longer hunted but reborn. She turned to him, her dark eyes soft for the first time. "We are still alive," she said, voice low. Silas gave a tired smile, blood on his lips. "For now, and that's enough." She crossed the yard, lowered herself beside him. For a long moment they sat in silence, watching the hills, where the smoke of enemy camp still rose. It was not over. They both knew reinforcements would come, that battle still waited beyond tomorrow. But in this dawn on this porch, they had won the right to breathe, to stand, to hope. Silas reached out, resting a calloused hand lightly on her shoulder. "This is your home now, as long as you'll have it." Awanada looked at him then, at the land stretching endless before them. She nodded once, slow and firm. "Then we fight together, until the end." The sun broke free of the horizon, flooding the valley with gold. The cabin, scarred and scorched, stood like a fortress of defiance. And on its porch sat a rancher and a warrior, no longer strangers, but allies bound by blood, by fire, and by a love forged in the darkest night.